Hello and namaskar. And this is Jugal KOUL speaking from the threshold of Sheetalnath Conversations. Uh, you're welcome into 32nd show of Sheetalnath Sunday Conversations. As per the practice in vogue, we have this evening rendezvous on every Sunday, connoting with the sun of our solar system. And that sun of our solar system seems to resonate with our inner sun, the sun of our consciousness, sun of our light. Uh, with the passage of time, this has become a very meeting place, a very interesting meeting place for all the lovers and followers of this program, this unique program, and for discovering the kind of that ethereal joy within our subconscious as a consequence of connecting to our roots, our vital roots of our civilization. Besides that, today also is a time, we are on 31st of October, we are at the end of the October. And the September and October, they envelope this, autumn, the one of the beautiful season of our annual cyclic season cycles. So we are also buying our adieu to the autumn. Uh, so, having said so, I would like to say that probably you are all enjoying this meandering, refreshing meander into the base of civilization, and this wonderful, anecdotal kind of real anecdotal, untold anecdotal communications. Today, on our 32nd show, uh, we feel like like listening the resonant drums, echoing drums that traverse and transport to the different ancient and medieval times of our history, especially the Kashmir in those times were one of the towering geography. It was a cradle of Indian civilization, and this is a wonderful kind of meet that we today are going to explore through this show, the entire uh, time in the period of ancient and the medieval Kashmir by Shaivism, because Kashmiris in modern times are known as the Shavist class, which is nothing but the Trika Shastra. And you know that in the centuries ninth onward, from Vasugupta and then finally Shambhunatha. Vasugupta gave Shiva Sutra, and then Shambhunatha and Utpal Deva came. They gave Sapat and Kriya and this Pratibhijigya. And then finally the great genius like Utpal, this Abhinav Gupta came in. He was a statistician, he was a dramatist, he was a rhetorician, and he wrote the 5,000 shlokas of Tantra Loka. And that's all about the medieval, about 19th century history of Shaivism. But today we are not going to we may be touching that part of our history of Shaivism, but we are going to explore the ancient part of our civilization, which is in which Shiva was in the ancient, in ancient forms, or Rudra, in Rudra form or Aghor form. I don't know. I'm not much expert on the subject, but then again, we are going to see that how the Kashmir Shaivism and the Kashmir Shaivist civilization was existing in our neighborhood, in Central Asia, in China, in Russia, Eurasia, and other places. We also know that we had the great people visiting Kashmir, Song to the, our, the head of our Sanatan Dharma, that Acharya. He also came to India. He also came to Kashmir and became the Acharya, Shankaracharya. He was Shankar and he became Shankaracharya once he came to the Sharda Desh. And we have a number of stories. We know all about it. To cut the story short, I would like to say that today we are certainly going to have this one of the most challenging and intricate subject. This could have not been done by a personality who was not a taller scholar and who was not a brilliant mind. So coming in tune with the spirit of this entire talk, I feel privileged to say and honor to say that we have invited one of the rarest genius of our contemporary times, one of the tallest Indologist, philosopher, theoretician, physicist, poet, and whatnot. He has many dimensions and many connotations. And when we can go on and on about his contributions, especially to the Indology. Uh, his name is Professor Subhash Kak, and internationally acclaimed and enormously respectable uh, regent professor uh, of uh, electrical engineering and the computer engineering at the University of Oklahoma Stillwaters. And he's also a visiting professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University. And besides that, he is one of the recipient of one of the fourth most, civilian award, PADAMSHRI, bestowed on him just because of his contribution to the science and technology. And he is also honored to be nominated as a member of this Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Council, Advisory Council. So he's a very remarkable personality. It is wonderful to have him on our show. His contribution to the literature, his contribution to especially the books, because he's one of, as I said, he's one of the tallest Indologists. His contribution to the books and other papers, they are very well acclaimed and well recognized among the consensus, among the topmost battery of researchers and scientists around the world. And he has written more than 20 books. Some of them I remember the name by name. Maybe one is this. This it's about this. I forgot. There are 3-4 books actually I know about. One is about this astronomical course of Rig Veda, Aswamedha, Indus Seal, Matter and Mind and Self, Architecture of Knowledge. He has a tremendous contribution. These books are worth reading. They're very popular amid the echelons of the people who understand this whole science. And certainly, we are delighted to have him with us. I don't think it is wise enough to stay and eclipse this great sun. It is better to bring him forth into the live telecast so that he has a conversation with you directly. So I will be inviting Padam Professor Subhash Kak to Sheetalnath Conversations show.
Namaskar, Jugalji. Delighted to be a part of this conversation. Wonderful. What you have done is great for everybody in India, Kashmir, India, everywhere else. So let's get going.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great delight and honor to have a personality of your level in our show. And certainly, I'm very much grateful and indebted that you accepted our invitation. And you are a native. What a wonder. We all cherish your position, but I know that you have the brilliance. You employed your brilliance and your scientific temper and mind, and a lot of hard work over the years, and created this entire edifice of revisiting our ancient history, ancient scientific history, Vedic scientific history, and which is very good for the probably the future generations of the humanity. So, having said that, coming to the topic, probably we must. Our topic today is about all Shaivism and in terms of civilization and in terms of spirituality, how it was in those times in the immediate neighborhood like Central Asia and Uttar Kuru, and the places like Gandhar. Gandhar was a part of India in those times, and also the far off places like Eurasia and. We have been to the recently one of my friend went to the Bali. Avatar Motaji, you must be knowing his name. He went to the Bali and other places. He said that we have the very live organic examples of in Indonesia symbols and the shivlings in Indonesia all along in the Philippines, in Malaysia, and they have a temple on every cremation ground there. And there are wonderful things. It's a very enchanting journey and voyage and odyssey. And also I came to know through him that even Athene and Greek, there are signs of Shaivism there. And I saw one of your two or three of your this videos last night, and I found that amazing description and research you have reached to the very depth of that research. This is a really great work, sir. So kindly let us crisscross through this whole basin of time and times in those times when Kashmir, when India was extended up to the Uttar Kuru, and other things, linguistic things up to the Persia, and in other parts of the country and the extended world. Please elucidate, sir.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's a tremendous amount of literature that we have from India, and this goes back in different layers. You have the Vedic Samhitas, you have the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, Atharva Veda, and Yajur Veda. These are the four Vedas. Then you have another layer of texts which are called the Brahmanas, and then you have Aranyakas, which are forest books. Then you have the Upanishads. After that, you have the Sutras. After that, you also have the various Shastras, Darshanas, the Puranas, the Itihasas. And the Itihasas, of course, are the two main Itihasas are Mahabharata and Ramayana. Then,
Yeah.
then you have many other agamic texts, which also include the Shaivagamas or Agamas. The word Agama means a tradition, and Shaivagama would be the traditional text related to Shaivism. So we have all these texts, and when these texts are analyzed, you find that in the earliest layer there's mention of only northwest India, and mainly centered around what is now Punjab and Gujarat and UP and Kashmir and so on, and northwest India. And then later on, much later, you find that there is also mention of places like Bactria, which is West Afghanistan, and you also have Uttar Kuru. Uttar Kuru is the region north of the Himalayas, which is now Xinjiang and which is Samarkand and Bukhara and all that. So it's very fascinating that there was tremendous interaction between Kashmir and Khotan. Khotan is a part of Xinjiang now. The city is now called Khotan. There's also a place called Kashgar, which is and Kashi and so on in Central Asia. So Sanskritic languages were spoken, and Gandhar, which is now Peshawar and so on. Very close to Peshawar, there's a place called Kashmir Shmast, which has had a lot of archaeological work done there in the last 20, 30 years. And that was also a place where there was, a kind of a school, and scholars used to come. So Kashmiri scholars crisscrossed both to the west and to the north to Central Asia. And why do we call them Kashmiri scholars? Because we do know their ethnicity. For example, the great translator Kumaraji, who was
Kumarji.
half Kashmiri. His father was a Kashmiri who went to Khotan and married a princess. Then she came back and she had this boy, Kumarji, when she lived here. Then they went back, but after some time, she decided to spend the rest of her life. She and her husband, for whatever reason, she decided to spend her life in Kashmir, while Kumarji was to play a central role in the development of Buddhism because his translations are still used. His translation of the Lotus Sutra, for example, is still used all over China. And then there were other texts also. For example, not many people know that Avalokiteshvara is one form of Buddha. In fact, the form of Buddha who is worshipped most widely in China and East Asia right now is Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara means one who is looking down. Ava meaning down. Loka is like looking down in compassion. Avalokiteshvara. In fact, wherever find these um, big sculptures or figures in Mahayan temples, they are to Avalokiteshvara in a feminine form. Now, the most famous text of Avalokiteshvara, which is sung or chanted every day from Vietnam to China to Japan, is in Sanskrit. It is chanted in Sanskrit. And it's called Nilakantha Dharani. just like you have sutras that we chant, the Buddhists or the Mahayana people chant dharanis. And this is in Sanskrit. And it is Avalokiteshvara worshipping Nilakant or worshipping Shiva and also Vishnu. So in all the Mahayana temples, that the worship that is being done to is to Shiva. And in fact, what happened was that Khotan and Xinjiang, the languages that were spoken were Khotanese, Gandhari. Gandhari is a Middle Indo-Aryan language, and it's somewhat related to Kashmiri. I think Kashmiri scholars need to do further research on this and look at the earliest forms of Kashmiri, which goes back to Lal Ded and so on, 700-800 years, and look at Gandhari, for which we have texts which are much earlier, say 2000 years, and see what are grammatical and other connections. So Gandhari was one of the vehicles, and of course Sanskrit, because what Kashmir was really a center of was Sanskrit knowledge. You have going all the way. Panini, of course, was from Gandhar, the great grammarian who wrote Ashtadhyayi. Amazing book, 4,000 rules of Sanskrit grammar, which have the capacity to churn out unlimited number of sentences, which has been compared to a computer system. In computer science, the most powerful model of computation is called a Turing machine. So Panini's grammar is equivalent to a Turing machine. So it can do anything that is possible. And it has rules, and then it has rules about rules, which is what we have in computer programs, right? You have rules, but there are certain other ways and certain form when you make certain statements, they're not necessarily about normal narrative, but rules about how that narrative has to be expressed. So the famous commentary on Panini's Ashtadhyayi was written by Patanjali, who was a Kashmiri. We know because he talks about these villages in Kashmir, and it's called Mahabhashya. So what
Mahabharata.
really made Sanskrit the powerful thing was Mahabhashya, because it's a beautiful, beautiful commentary. And then you also had, according to Indian scholars, uh, uh, there there was only one Patanjali. One is, of course, the one who wrote Mahabhashya. Then there is also Patanjali of the Yoga Sutra. Just imagine, yoga is the vehicle of Sanatan Dharma. You look at the Bhagavad Gita, all that Krishna speaks about is yoga of different kinds, right? So, Yoga Sutra by Patanjali, right? And then Patanjali was also associated with a final editing of Ayurveda. So Kashmir is that source. Now, uh, some of the other Puranas which have had tremendous influence on Indian arts and worship, sculpture, and one of those great Puranas is called Vishnu Dharmottar Puran. That was written in Kashmir. Then, of course, you already mentioned Shaivism, studying from Vasugupta's Shiva Sutras and so on, and the great Utpal Dev, Abhinav Gupta, and so on. So we've already mentioned that, and this is, of course, astonishing power, because prior to that, and in all civilizations, people have always wondered about, what is the mystery, who are we, and people have talked about the soul, or they've said there is God, or God is up in the skies, or God is hidden. What was done in Kashmir, uh, Kashmir Shaivism, which is purest form of Vedanta, was that, look, uh, um, Chaitanyam Atma, the very first sutra of the Shiva Sutra is Chaitanyam Atma. Atma is your consciousness. So, God, Shiva, Shivoham, that you are Shiva. So, you will find answers to all your questions by looking within, because Shiva is within you, right? And this is amazingly powerful. Now, you mentioned Avtar Motaji going to Bali, and we do know, because Indonesian history is very well understood now, that in Indonesia, it was declared, and this is in their very motto of Indonesian state. It was declared that Shiva and Buddha are one. That you call them sometimes by different names, but Shiva and Buddha are one because there were Shaivite kingdoms. There were also certain Buddhist kingdoms. Because, well, what is the difference? Buddha is where you are using your analysis to a certain extent, and then what remains is, of course, the mystery, right? Or Buddha in his own life sort of refused to answer the question, is there Atma? And therefore some people said that Buddha accepted the philosophy of anatma or anatta in Pali, right? But on his deathbed, there is a sutra called Mahaparinirvana Sutra. uh, on his deathbed, when people came to him, he was dying because he had eaten some bad stuff. He was 80 years old. He was eating some bad stuff, and then he was very, very sick, and he's dying. So he called all his disciples, and his disciples started crying. They said, "Who will? You have said there is nothing. Who will look after us? What's going to happen to us?" In fact, one of those disciples was a person called Chunda. So he started crying, and then Buddha finally said that, "Look, I did all these years tell you that there is nothing." And I said that, well, I didn't quite say that. I wouldn't answer that question. But I wasn't answering that question because you were too attached to your old ways. And then he gives an example. He says, look, supposing there is a baby, and the baby is still suckling at her mother's breast, right? And then the baby falls sick. So the mother takes the baby to the doctor, and the doctor says, let the baby not have milk for 4 days or a certain number of days, and give the baby this medicine. And after that, the baby can have milk again. So what the mother does now, the baby wants the milk. So what the mother does is she puts some bitter paste on her breast, and the baby goes to it, finds it very bitter, and turns away and starts crying. And so the mother is able to give it medicine and so on. But after 4 days, she washes the paste, bitter paste, or she's probably done it earlier, and the baby can have the milk again. So what Buddha tells Chunda and everybody else who's assembled, that look, I didn't tell you the secret of the Atman because you were too attached, like that baby. You needed to be cured. But now that I'm going to pass on, let me tell you that indeed there is something which survives our body. There is, and you can call it Buddha Dhatu or Buddha Garbha, or you can call it Atman, or you can call it whatever else, because these are only words, right?
These are only words. Yeah.
These are only words. And this was recognized within all of Central Asia. So what the great um, missionaries or teachers, acharya is the right word, all these great acharyas from Kashmir who went out towards northeast and transformed northeast. Northeast meaning China, Japan. Japan is
But
Zen. Zen is from Dhyan, as you
yeah,
know. Dhyan, the word Dhyan, which is a part of yoga, went to China and they called it Chan because they couldn't pronounce Dhyan. And Chan, as it went to Japan, became Zen, right? So all of this stuff went there. And in fact, one of the great Chinese scholars wrote a famous essay 100 years ago. He says, it's amazing how India was able to completely uh, steer Chinese civilization in a certain direction without fighting a battle, just by the power of its scholars. And many of these scholars were from Kashmir because Kashmir was next. And then these scholars would go, like Kumarajiv, they would go to Khotan.
Nagarjun also.
Nagarjuna was from Andhra Pradesh. He was from further south. But I mentioned Nilakanta Dharani. The reason why Nilakant, Shiva, is worshipped
Shiva.
so much because Avalokiteshvara, one of the tenets of Buddhism is karuna, compassion. That's why um, bodhisattva or a person who's enlightened is able to look with compassion at everybody all around, right? So the reason Avalokiteshvara himself worships Shiva is because Shiva is the symbol of the greatest compassion. Nilakantha, because he
Nilakanta.
takes that poison, halahal, to save the universe. See, who can do an act of greater compassion than what was done by Shiva, by Nilakantha? And that's the reason why that even Avalokiteshvara, praises him or lauds him. And that is this symbol. Now, what is less known, and I wrote a paper on this very recently in a historians conference which took place in Belarus 2 or 3 months ago. What is less known is that it was not only Northeast Asia, but also Northwest Eurasia, all the Slavic world. The Slavic world is the world of the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Czechs, the Poles, the Serbians. That is the languages from Central Europe eastwards. The, the highest divinity of the Slavic world before it was Christianized, and it was Christianized very violently. It was Christianized in a process which is called the Northern Crusades. And only recently, certain parts of East Europe were Christianized only a few hundred years ago. So they held on to their old religion. And their chief divinity was called Shvetavid. Vid is, of course, a Sanskrit word meaning
With,
know
yeah.
all. And Shvet is white, or it can also mean prakash or light. In Kashmir Shaivism, if you read Utpal Dev or if you read Abhinav Gupta, Shiva is called Prakasha. Prakash. Shiva is light, right? And Shakti is Vimarsha, which is where a reflection takes place, right? Which is our mind. Our body is Shakti, but what makes it possible for us to know anything is Shiva. And there is a slight distinction between the Shaivite way and Vaishnavite way. I must also tell you that we know that the worship of Vishnu was also established in Kashmir before Vasugupta and Shiva Sutra. For example, even Avanti Varman, he built
Oh,
two great temples. One was to Vishnu, another was to Shiva
Vihara, yeah.
in Avantipur, right? So the difference between, and I must tell you this, the difference between Shaivism and Vaishnavism is this, and this is mentioned both in Bhagavad Gita and also in his Vritti by Abhinav Gupta. In Bhagavad Gita, it's mentioned that you have Smriti, Gyan, and Apohan. You firstly remember, you see, you remember, you obtain wisdom, which is Gyan, and then all this wisdom you cannot hold on. Then there is a certain forgetting, which is called Apohan, and that's why we get separated from true knowledge and understanding. In Abhinav Gupta, this equation is turned a bit around. And what is said is that there is Gyan first, and then Smriti, and then Apohan. Because the Gyan is within us all the time, because Shiva is within us, and Shiva is consciousness. And consciousness has access to everything. In fact, all our knowledge, even in our modern conversations and talking about it, is in our conversation. Is in our consciousness, right? When we
Right.
do mathematical equations, when we read a novel, when we go to different places, we ultimately carry all that experience in our consciousness. So consciousness is primary. So the central focus of the Kashmiri take on the mystery was that consciousness is primary. From consciousness arises through a process of reflection, ordinary knowledge, because consciousness is extraordinary knowledge. It's para.
Para.
From para comes apara. And then we seem to get separated and we seem to lose sense of it because of a process called apohan. Apohan means forgetting, right? So therefore, therefore, these two are really different takes to being connected to reality. So now, what happened was Northeast Shvetavid as the chief divinity of the Slavic world. Shvetavid has four faces. You know, the central idea of the Vedas is that divi- all our representations of divinity are projections in our mind. So depending upon how it's being projected, it has a different face. For example, Shiva is also Rudra or Aghora, right? Rudra means the hot side, which makes us cry, because
Yes.
light has two aspects: heat and light. So Rudra is heat. Uh, Shiva himself is light, auspiciousness. It also has the mystery, the propensity to make it grow and make it beautiful, and that is the third phase, which is Vamadeva, or which is also Parvati. Sometimes, you know, Shiva is shown in three faces, as in Elephanta caves. One is Rudra, one is Shiva himself, or the other side is Parvati or Vamadeva. And then also you have Tat Purush as the mystery, and then Ishana. Ishana is the fifth face, right? So, so you have these five faces, and likewise in Kashmir, even Vishnu was shown with multiple faces, right? So this is the really heart of Sanatan Dharma, that uh, that God, if you use the term God, and as we know, the word God itself is of Sanskrit origin. Did you know that Sanskrit God
God,
is Sanskrit?
God is Sanskrit origin.
Yeah,
Oh
and
my.
how do we know that? This is a slight side path. We know that in Khotan, or
Shiv,
before that
Shiv.
in Avesta, the word that is used for God is Swatava. Tava is power. Swa mean itself powered is Swatava, right?
Shotava.
ताव चढ़ गया means गुस्सा आ गया, power आ गया. Swatava is, and it's attested. We have it in writing, Swatava and Avesta. When Kashmiris went to Central Asia, this swa becomes kha. You know, like swara. Swara is one name for the sun, and it becomes khar. You know,
Khar.
khar is also sun in Persian or in Gandhari. From swar becomes khar. And in Kashmiri also. Now, of course, sometimes people say khar means donkey. That's another word. Swar means khar,
Khar.
becomes khar. So swatava became khwatava, khwatav. And khwatav became khuda. And from there it went to Persian as khuda. Khotav became Khoda. And from there
Oh,
it went to Germanic world through the Slavic world and became Gott, G-O-T-T.
oh.
God became God. Now,
What a
uh,
image.
people in Pakistan, about 30, 40 years ago, when Ziaul Haq was the president, they discovered, because in Pakistan they say Khuda for God, they discovered that Khuda was not Arabic. So a campaign has started in Pakistan not to use the word Khuda. So now they don't want to say Khuda Hafiz, they want to say
It's
Allah Hafiz,
Allah.
because Khuda is a Sanskrit word. See, this is such problems people have. But let's
Prepare man.
let's go back to our story. So the main divinity of the Slavic world is Shvetavid, the knower of light, who is Shiva, right? Because Shvet is another equivalent word for Prakash, for light, because you know light is a combination of all possibilities. In the representations of Shvetavid in Baltics, for example, and there was a big temple there. There are four faces of Shvetavid. The northern face is called uh, Swarga. In, you know, this is not, and they're using Sanskrit words. The northern face is called Swarga.
Sarga.
The western face is called Parjanya, who is one of the
Oh,
Vedic names of Indra. The
Persian.
southern face is called Lada, which is another name for Prithvi, and
Okay.
the eastern name is called Moksha. They call it
My,
Mokosh or Moksha.
my God.
So now, the Slavic people, the Russians and the Poles and the Lithuanians, they are trying to get connected back to Shvetuved, which is another name, as I said, for Shiva. And likewise, they worship, they found at a place called Panjiket near Samarkand, an ancient temple, and they discovered that, along wherever the main vehicle was Buddhism, Maheshwara or Shiva was also a divinity in Gandhara, in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, and everywhere else. So Maheshwara or Shiva was another divinity that there was. So uh, the influence, if one were to say that this influence had a very strong locus arising out of Kashmir, from whatever historical stories we have about Nilakanta Dharani, for example, that was, we know it was, I think, a Kashmiri named Brahma Bhatt or somebody, who, because we know he was Kashmiri, he went and took this Sanskrit text and it's still chanted in Sanskrit. And then, of course, the story of Kumaraji, right? And then the influence during the times of Lalita Aditya, for example, where he not only conquered Central Asia but also parts of North India. There was a lot of stuff. There was also patronage, but it was primarily the great power of thought and clarity of that vision and total equality. When you read all these texts, you find, for example, we have accounts of how Abhinav Gupta would talk to, would give his pravachans, right? And we know that he gave these pravachans to groups where they were both men and women. It was totally equal. Everybody was equal. The
Really?
whole question of this distinction between jati and so on did not exist. We have evidence to that going all the way back to Nilmat Puran, or you have other, you have Sharada, Mahatmya, and so on. There are many other texts, and we know that indeed the focus was on mystery in a way where each person, as great a directness as possible. Why is Kashmir Shaivism so powerful right now all across the world? Because there's no mystery here. You're not using words in an obscure way. You're saying that, look, the the problem, the ultimate problem of science is the problem of consciousness. And Kashmir Shaivism is about consciousness. It says that the mystery of reality is consciousness, and that consciousness is within us. So then you can turn in and then say, well, how am I as a scientist going to approach it, going to analyze it? Am I going to analyze it as a physicist, as a doctor, or as a yogi? Which is why then we can see why Patanjali, for example, if indeed we accept, because there are certain Western scholars who say, no, it could not have been one person. There must have been three Patanjalis. How could one person have done so much in so many different fields? That's not true. People can do work in many different fields, right? So if it was the same Patanjali, how he was doing Ayurveda, he was doing grammar, his Mahabhashya, and then he was doing yoga as well.
That's so wonderful, sir. Actually, you said about the Rodanovari. He is also the Rudra. You had said something. Yes, I have a video yesterday into, and it was also the form of Rudra. Rudra is the, I mean, Lord Shiva, nobody else.
Oh, yeah. There are many such correspondences when you go to all the Slavic nations and look at their words, and you find Rodnovery, for example. There are some people in Russia who are trying to uh, create a connection to their old pre-Christian religion or worship of Rod as Rudra. That is, of course, and there's also Rudrani and so on. All of those correspondences that we have, and we find tremendous parallels with Kashmir and Indian thought. Now, of course, there are some who are connected or who feel inspired by this theory that arose 150 years ago, namely Aryan invasion theory, that the Aryans brought this all this knowledge
From
into
Europe.
India. Now, there are only two problems with this theory. First of all, as I mentioned, when you look at the Vedic Samhitas, you have no mention of any place outside of Northwest India. And the astronomy of that, on which I have also written a book, and many peer-reviewed papers, the astronomy of that does go back to at least the third millennium BC, which is much earlier than the so-called invasion of India. So that doesn't quite work. And and the other thing is, and I've also written on that, if you look at some of the most basic words that are used, for example, words for divinity, words for water, words for land, these are common words. And you find that in Europe, different words are used for that. For example, for water, there is jalam or jal. There is also neer. There is also udak, right? There is also vari. See, now I just mentioned four. There are about 20. Vari is like water. Udak is like vodka. Udaka
Uda-
is vodka. Vodka is water,
Vodka. Vodka.
right? In Russian. Neer is a word in Greece, right? So you find different names of our water in different parts of Europe. They're all in Sanskrit. Now, if they came from Europe, then only one of those names would have come into Sanskrit. Do you see that? While all of those names are here, and this is not just for water, for so many different words, so many different names. Now, of course, there was colonialism in the 19th century, and Indians, were powerless. India was the one of the wealthiest, or probably the wealthiest place in 1800, before the British became most powerful. India was 25% of the world economy. By the time the British left, the share of India's economy had fallen to about 2%. So India was impoverished. There were famines, there was this and that. So Indians felt that, and then Indian education system was destroyed by the British because they replaced it by their own. So Indians felt that maybe all this was right, and the rationale that was given for British colonialism was that Indians were into superstition, they needed to be educated, etc., etc., which is totally false, because India was the world's leading place for science centuries after centuries. Even somebody called Said al-Andalusi, who was a uh,
Yeah.
Islamic historian writing in Spain, I think 1168 CE or so, he wrote a book on science of all the nations, and he spoke about Persia, India, China, Rome, the Arab world, and Europe. And he said, this is 1168, he said the world's premier scientific nation is India. So it was generally recognized, and not only mathematics and geometry, the figure for zero, the um, implicit gravitation in Aryabhat's rotation of the earth, or Bhaskaracharya calculus of the Kerala School of Mathematics. And in modern times also, the deepest scientific theory, quantum mechanics, its creator was a Vedantin, an Austrian named Erwin Schrödinger, who claimed that the central idea came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma. So that we have had this whole tradition which somehow, in the flush of European colonialism, which was a form of racism, where their attempts were to put down all that they actually encountered, many Indians also internalized it, and they thought that, well, maybe we didn't have it. All that we have obtained, that knowledge, is from Europe. And somehow another implicit aspect of this colonialism was that, well, the Europeans came to India and then they intermarried with the locals, and that's why the Indians became sort of weak. and they became superstitious and so on. Now we all know that that's a bunch of crock, as they say. That's all stupid. Now we're the same Indians spread all over the world. They're the most successful, the most affluent people in America, for example, which is where we have a level playing field, are the Indians. This is the latest census figures. The leaders of the most powerful companies of the world are Indians. You look at Microsoft, you look at IBM, you look at Google and Adobe, look at all around you, a lot of the stuff. So all that racist theories of one people superior to another is nonsense. And I think what becomes, or even forgetting about the contested problem of where people came from, where the Aryans came from, we do know from Kashmiri history and the spread of the ideas of Shiva or Shaivism, which are of course based in the Veda itself, Vedic text itself, that you have Rudra has 11 forms, which is consciousness unveils in 11 different forms, and Sankhya has 25 tattvas, and Kashmir Shaivism has 25 plus 11, which is 36 tattvas. So we are all going back to the Vedic system that we can read so clearly about in the many different texts that we have, and this is what Kashmiri Shaivism is not to be seen as something as a departure, and the one point of difference of emphasis between the Vedanta of Kashmir Shaivism and Vedanta which was taught by Shankaracharya is that Shankaracharya himself was a sannyasi. So he spoke about Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya, right? That Brahman is truth, which is, of course, accepted as one reality, unchanging reality, because it's transcendent. And this Jagat is Mithya because it's transient. And that is certainly true. But what Kashmir Shaivism
You suppose it other way around.
Kashmir Shaivism says is that this Jagat itself is an embodiment of Shiva. And
It's part of.
therefore, by participating in this Jagat itself, you can obtain knowledge. You don't have to go to the forest or you don't have to leave. You can participate fully, right? Where Prakash and Vimarsha come together, where Shiva and Shakti come together. And it's at that samavai, it's at that meeting point that you obtain knowledge. It all hangs together. It's beautiful. It's of extraordinary power, and it's of extraordinary power, I believe, not only for the arts, for a person's own understanding. Whatever your sadhana might be, could be dance or music or painting or whatever else, or
Ethnography.
even as a businessman, right? You need to have imagination. You need to think better than others. And you are a true businessman. You want to spread the wealth to everybody. Then you're not selfish. You don't sankuchit. Your mind is not sankuchit. You don't want to hold it on. So in all of those things, uh, the recognition that you are Shiva, the recognition that divinity is within you, and it's also within everybody else. That's where that compassion, that karuna comes from. That compassion that in the Nilakantha Dharani, the whole world, the whole of East Asia, even now chants every day. They are chanting through the mouth of Buddha himself a prayer to Shiva, prayer to Shiva as Nilakantha. It's beautiful.
That's so wonderful, Servo. Astounding, revelations you have shared with us today. Every word of you is based on that very deep, in-depth understanding and on face knowledge of all these things from a scientific bent of mind, an elevated bent of mind. Yes, I have also heard that this Buddha was always said to be the incarnation of Vishnu, and so it was Hariharan and something because Shiva and somewhere in some parts of the country that Shiva and Vishnu they became one and it became Hariharan. But in Kashmir also during the times of Shaivism and during Avanti Varman's time, as you said, we had the Viharas and all that. So was he taken as a reincarnation of the Vishnu as well? Is it accepted theory or?
Oh, these are all in our mind. See, there is a difference between Atma and Manas. Manas is our mind. Manas is an instrument which is colored by our experience and by our insight, right? In our mind, we can see one as many, from unity to multiplicity, right? Because of the state that we are in. If the ultimate is the peak of the mountain, depending upon the path that you take, you might have different stories to tell. So, all these avatars are then different stories to speak about in this journey to the one. So, you could say, as some people have said it, and these are only claims. So, somebody can say that such and such person is somebody's avatar. I mean, these are things that cannot be proven or disproven. So there are
Yes.
many people who claimed that Buddha was an avatar of Vishnu, or people could even say that there have been other avatars of one divinity or the other. But ultimately, when you probe it further, um, as I mentioned, and this is done with extraordinary clarity in the Vedanta tradition, and not just Kashmir Shaivism. Even if you go to the Shakta tradition, right? You have the whole mind or the whole cosmos represented as the Devi in Sri Vidya or Sri Chakra, and right in
Yes.
the middle of it is a point, a bindu, which is where Shiva resides. So that what it means is that in a certain way, when you explore the universe, you'll only see Devi, you'll only see Prakriti. And the more you look for it, the more Shiva will become invisible. Why? Because you and I, or anybody else, the more we are looking for who we are only looking out, because who we are looking for is within us. Do you see that?
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
where that apohan has occurred. You will not find Shiva in Shakti because you yourself are Shiva. Your awareness itself is Shiva. So it's coming of them together, which is what is also seen as Shiva as Ardhanarishwara. Ardhanari, half Nari, meaning half Prakriti or Shakti. So it's Purush and Prakriti together, right? So you can see avatars in different ways. And we are all, when each one of us, we are also avatar. Everybody is an avatar of Shiva. If you really know yourself, then Shiva is descended. Actually, Shiva is not descended. Avatar meaning, our meaning below, tar meaning crossing, below crossing. Because Shiva is always there. Shiva doesn't even have to descend. Do you see that? Now, the
But
reason
ever pervading, ever
the,
pervading.
yeah, the reason why we speak of avatars of Vishnu is because Vishnu represents the moral order of the universe. You know, just being aware is not enough. You also have to have a moral order. You have to have principles, truthfulness, yama, niyamas, and so on, which are a part of Yoga Sutras also, as we
Yoga
know.
Sutra, Patanjali.
So, though that moral order is represented by Vishnu, and Vishnu, the word Vishnu itself means, Vish means to pervade, which pervades the entire cosmos, right? Because you cannot have awareness without a moral order, because otherwise everything will be totally unstrung, will not be connected. In fact, in his discussion of Yogachar Buddhism, for example, this is what Abhinav Gupta says, that look, if there was no transcending mind, if there was no Shiva, then all the contents of your mind will be disconnected. You have to pirow them in a mala. You have to string them together in a mala, right? And that stringing together, that mala is Shiva. Your memory points are like these muktafal, jisko kehte hain Kashmiri mein, right? These little beads, jewel beads. These are your memory points.
Beats.
But what is it that holds it together? Is is Shiva, is something transcendent, and therefore, ultimately, since the moral order and awareness and consciousness are two sides of the same thing, therefore Shiva and Vishnu are really one, and that's where Harihar comes from. And this is something which was also recognized in Southeast Asia. Harihar was an image which was used in Cambodia, in Vietnam, Champa, that is, and in Indonesia, as a form of supreme divinity, and in Kashmir as well, and in India as well, everywhere.
So you talked about this that Austrian the scientist who created this quantum mechanics. He was inspired by the Vedantic philosophy and thought. Even Einstein, you mentioned somewhere that Einstein was also I mean, in a way, motivated by his one of the best his disposition of this quantum physics. He was inspired by the Vedic science. His wife, indeed, his wife took it from some scientist, some Russian scientist. Tell us something about this, because we really want to know what Einstein was hiding in his bag, which was
Well,
Vedic.
yeah, it's a very, very interesting story. The story is that in 1898, um, in New York, um, Sarah Bernhardt was the most famous actress of those times. She was a French woman, and she was traveling with a troupe to the US. And at that time, two of the most famous people were the great Serbian American engineer and visionary Nikola Tesla. You know, after whom the Tesla car is now named, Nikola
Yes.
Tesla. He was born in Serbia, and when he came to England, came to the U.S. as an immigrant, he pleaded for alternating current, and against him was Edison, Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor, who was for direct current, and Tesla had invented an alternating current motor, and finally Tesla's engineering won. So from that perspective, we're living in the age of Tesla. So anyway, he was very famous, and he wanted to uh, transmit energy wirelessly. So he was interested in that problem. So Sarah Bernhardt threw a party, and she invited Vivekananda, who was traveling at that time in North America, and Tesla to that party, and they had a conversation, and they both wrote about what happened in that conversation, which we know from Tesla's diary and from letters that Vivekananda wrote soon after that meeting. So what Vivekananda told Tesla was that, look, according to Indian physics, and by Indian physics he meant Vaisheshik Sutra and Vedanta. He says, according to Indian physics, it is possible to convert mass into energy, because all these Mahabhutas eventually become Vayu and Akash. We know that because you have five Mahabhutas, but you have Prithvi, Apas, Tejas, Vayu, and Akash. But
Akash.
during Pralay, all of these become Akash. And Akash is, of course, the vehicle for consciousness. And in Vedanta, consciousness is the primary category. And it's from consciousness that the physical universe emerges. Okay. So, and now this is, of course, very complex. I'm sure that Vivekananda wasn't telling all of this to Tesla. But what he did tell Tesla is that, according to Indian physics, it is possible to convert mass, which are the Mahabhutas, the Prithvi primarily, into energy. So he says, why don't you look for it? And once you're able to do it, first of all, you'll be able to solve your problem of transmission of energy wirelessly. And it will also establish Indian or Vedic science on a sound footing for the Westerner. They would find proof of it. This is 1898. Now, Elena, I think Einstein's wife, who she was Serbian, and she was a physicist also. In fact, the 1905, the great paper of Einstein's, for in which he made that clear exposition of relativity theory, which had been done earlier by Henri Poincaré, but he did it with clarity, which was sort of not there in the earlier work. So the original, when the paper was submitted for publication to Annalen der Physik, and we have it from one of the editors of that journal. Both Einstein's and Albert's and his wife's name were listed as co-authors. But when the proofs came, Einstein took his wife's name out. And so he got all the glory, right? And then E equal to MC square was a corollary to that. But he must have felt bad about it because when they got divorced soon after that. They had two children, and one of them had to be hospitalized. He had some, psychotic and some other problems. Yeah, he remained hospitalized most of his life. So when they had their divorce finalized, in that contract, or there was a statement which Albert Einstein promised to give the entire prize money to his wife should he win the Nobel Prize. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for many years. I think he won it in 1919 or 1921, much later. Why did he now? So people have surmised, why did he want to give the Nobel Prize money to his wife when they had been divorced for so long? Was because he was feeling sad,
Guilt,
guilty.
guilt,
And
guilt.
they now say, there are some people who are saying that his wife must have been in correspondence with Nikola Tesla, and Nikola Tesla must have told her that, look, here I met this amazing man, this young man from India with this incredible knowledge, and he says it should be possible to convert energy and mass, interconvert energy and mass. So, from that perspective, of course, there's a lot of surmise here. We don't have any proof, although there are some scholars who believe that this is how it happened. But it is true that according to Vedas or Vedanta and Vaisheshika, it is possible to convert mass into energy. That's a part of Indian physics, right?
That's it.
And it is also true that not only Schrödinger, the Austrian, but even Heisenberg, when he came to visit India, I think in the late 1920s, he went to Shantiniketan, he went and talked to Tagore, and then he said, the way to understand quantum mechanics is through Vedanta. What we found perplexing becomes all clear. And there are other historians of science who have said that quantum mechanics is perfectly consistent with Vedanta, because in quantum mechanics you have the observer and the observed. There is a dichotomy, which is exactly what we have in Vedanta. You have the Atman, and then you have the Bhutas, Mahabhutas. The Mahabhutas are governed by physical laws, which in Sanskrit is called Rita, Rita, and from Rita you also have like Ritam, Ritu, like a season, because there's a law. Seasons come one after another. There's a Ritu, that is an
Yeah.
expression of Rita. So you have Rita, but Chaitanya or Ishvara or Shiva is able to change the bhutas through drishti, and this is called drishti srishtivad. That through drishti alone, because he doesn't have to take a physical form, because otherwise he'll become a part of the bhutas also, right? And my friend, a very famous physicist who died last year, Indian, George Sudarshan, he's from Kerala, and he's also a Vedantin. We met many times at Vedanta congresses. In the 1970s, he wrote a very famous paper, which is called the quantum Zeno effect. And he showed that in physics also, just by observation, you can change the outcome of the physical system. That's called the quantum Zeno effect. And this is a part of the Vedas. This is a part of Ishvara is within us. We might think that, hey, we are bodies, we are physical machines. But which is why going in by finding that unity with Shiva within you, then you can also have control over your body through observation, which is why, and that has tremendous implications for health, for example. Modern medicine is facing a crisis. 70-80% of these medical papers cannot be replicated. They do that, they publish papers, then some other researchers come along and they try to copy it, and it doesn't work. Why? Because we are just not machines. There's also mind, and modern medicine, allopathy, leaves out the mind, right? You also have things like the placebo effect. 30% of the people get well if they are given sugar pills and they are told that this is actual medicine. You know that that's called placebo effect.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
get well. So
Placebo
how
effect.
did that happen? So it's a complex. The body is a complex interplay of mind and matter, and modern medicine only deals with matter. That's why we must also go back to Ayurveda, which is where, once again, we must give our namaskar to Patanjali because he also edited the last version of Ayurveda, right?
Oh,
So many of
great.
these paths go back to Patanjali and Kashmir.
Wonderful. For the that's I mean every discovery, every research of you is so potentially profound, and it's so enjoyable at the same time. It's very lucid. Presentation is very lucid. Uh, I want to tell our esteemed viewers, our esteemed people, diaspora, who are watching this program across the globe, that Dr. Subhash Kak, we have a privilege that he has done a very great revolutionary proposition he has presented about that will change the entire paradigm of the space. And that is about that this the three dimension of space, which was which is the convention being followed and observed till date. He says that it is the E dimension. So that's a very revolutionary change, and it has something to do with the gravitation, because till now we have been all trying to locate the source of gravitation, and somewhere Professor Subhash Kak has tried to play it. And there's a lot of respite for the people who are very sensitive and who think that the galaxies are, going at a very faster speed. They are going away, and one fine morning, this whole planet and the entire thing will vanish. But probably it's a great respite for us, that because of e dimensions in the space, maybe it will remain intact for for millions and billions of years. Say something about your this great achievement, sir,
Okay.
because I think after quantum mechanics, this is the first revolutionary proposition. It is not lesser than the theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, and other things. We are very proud of you for this wonderful proposition. Tell us something about it in a
Okay.
layman's language. We don't
You know,
understand the language of physicists.
yeah, when you look at history of physics or science for the past 2000 years, in the beginning, you have objects which are, you had the clockwork system, you had the planets. It's like a clockwork, like a machine, and they are
Yes.
going so on. And then people thought about gravitation, and then the gravitation law, that it is inverse square law, was discovered. Kepler and Newton and others. But all along, until recently, the idea in history of physics has been that that all these objects that we have, planets and stars and galaxies and so on, they exist in a three-dimensional space, and this three-dimensional space is like a container, like a bucket in which all these things are happening. Now, what happened was that early last year, when the pandemic started and we were all stuck, my wife and I were stuck in Miami, where our children live. And while thinking about all of those things, suddenly the idea flashed to me. And I had done some mathematical stuff on this prior, and published stuff on this. And I can give you very quickly background to that. Often nowadays, because everything, computers control everything, so we feel that everything should be binary, right?
Binary. Yeah.
Zeros and ones. And logic also should be binary, yes or no.
Hmm.
But about 40, 50 years ago, logicians discovered that binary is not optimal. And if you're counting in integers, ternary is optimal. Ternary meaning three. And
Three.
in fact, in the 1970s, people even tried to build computers based on ternary logic because they would be more efficient. But it didn't go beyond a certain point because binary technology was already established, ICE integrated circuits, etc. So people have started assuming that that binary is actually optimal. Even in physics papers, people say that. Now, what's interesting, before I lose the thread of this, in Ayurveda, it is ternary. You have three doshas.
Oh,
In Sankhya, you have three gunas: sattva, rajas, and tamas, right? Three doshas. So somehow, intuitively, Indian rishis had discovered that three is central. Or when you do Gayatri mantra, you speak of bhu, bhuva, swaha. Bhu meaning the body or the earth, bhuva meaning the atmosphere, swaha meaning the heavens or the sun. So likewise, bhu, bhuva, swaha, body, the pranas are bhuva, and swaha is consciousness. So there are three, everywhere three. Now, so mathematicians had discovered it 50 years ago. And then last year, and I also published some stuff on it. And there's an interesting story because, all these paths come together for some reason that you don't know. 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited to give a keynote address at a conference in Austria on multi-valued logic. And even though I had not worked on multiple valued logic, this is when I discovered all this stuff about ternary logic being optimal. And then I discovered that it's really not three, but it's E logic in 2.718, which is optimal. And so I published some stuff on it in 2019. And when I was stuck during the pandemic, tossing and turning, the idea came to me that since everything in reality is optimal, if E logic is optimal, then space itself should be E dimensional. So I wrote up stuff on it and I sent it to Nature's scientific reports, and it solves one of the big crises of modern cosmology related to the speed with which the universe is expanding. So it solves it, which is so it got published. Then I published something else which solves some other problem, which is not to mean that now the whole world is going to say, yeah, you've solved everything. Because science is always back and forth. People are
like
going to challenge it, fight, and this and that. And that is a process which will unfold as it is. But what's interesting is that it also has the potential to explain gravitation itself,
yes,
the property of
that's
space. Now, that's very important. Why? Because physicists over the last 50 years have been unable to unify all the forces. You can unify the weak force and the strong force and the electromagnetic force. That have been unified, and they've tried very hard to bring in gravitation also, and that's not been possible. But this says gravitation is a consequence of e-dimensionality. So it would then solve that, and not only that, because if gravitation is because of e-dimensionality, e-dimensionality should also work in our bodies itself. For example, in the genetic code itself. So I've shown that the genetic code also can be seen as a consequence of e-dimensionality. Now, these are all on preprints. They're going to be published in journal articles. There are many journal articles that have been published where peer review has occurred. There are two Nature Scientific Reports articles, one on the solution of this cosmological puzzle, the other on something called asymptotic freedom. Asymptotic freedom is, if you have a proton consists of three quarks, and they are positive. If they're positive, they should be repelled from each other, right? But they stay together without interaction, excepting when they are go far apart, then they stay together. And I show that also as a consequence of e-dimensionality. There are lots of possible implications, and where it'll go we shall see. But the fact that you can explain something very interesting in the genetic code, I think is of some great significance. So it's something that's been a great adventure for me for the last 2 years, and that stuff is continuing, and we shall see where all it'll go.
Oh,
And as
wonderful.
we see, it's totally consistent with our own Vedic tradition of firstly optimality of three, central to Gayatri Mantra, central to the very
Tired.
yoga, triads, the triads of Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti. There are triads everywhere, triads of
Yeah.
Ayurveda, triads of Sankhya. So it all seems to come together, and that's beautiful.
So wonderful, sir. So wonderful talking. We cannot end. I feel like going on and on and on. And but somewhere down the line, we have to see time constraints as well. And you are also a very very busy schedule. I was just thinking about now. Let's come down and scale down to India, the subcontinent, planet to country, country to state, and state to the place, Shitalat. So, Shitalat conversation we started around 6.5 months ago, and on the basis of because the premise and premise of Shitalat, it inspired us. And I have heard that you were also inhabiting in Sathu, and in a way I put it in a new way, we are all Shitalnathians. So in that context, I would like you to say a line or two about your reminiscence and something great, something joyful to our entire diaspora people who are watching, not about this originality or some kind of a parochiality, but all about this whole experiences of yours, the place you belong to.
I was born in Sattu Barbarsha, not very far from Sheetalnath. And
Okay.
I used to run up and down the gullies of Sattu and nearby places, from all the way from Dalgate to Habba Kadal to Amira Kadal and all those places, up and down, evening, this and that, and see the lights of Dalgate. You walk on the Sattu. Setu in Sanskrit meaning
Say two.
embankment. So
Perfect.
I'm from there. My father was a veterinarian, and from time to time, every 2 years, he would be transferred from one city to another or one town to another. Um, 6 or 7 places in my high school, from school, right from the beginning: Bilawar, Basoli, Udhampur,
Hey. Oh,
Kulgam, Varmul, Baramulla, Leh, Ladakh, Anantnag. And so wherever we were, we would come to Srinagar sometime, or for Shivratri, or Zaram Satham, Janmashtami, whatever, or climb Shankaracharya Hill. So Sattu was our base. And so I've been a part of the Sheetalnath conversation as long as I've been alive.
that's so wonderful, sir. That's so pleasure. And now I want to explore certain part of you, which I can approach because I'm also part of that particular trait, or art, or literary understanding, or literary cognitive understanding. That is the poetry, because you are a poet who writes in English and Hindi, and certainly we also as your followers, because at the level, because you're a physicist or an Indologist, but also as a native, we are really interested to just have a recitation of one of your poems, so that it gives a glimpse of your another side, another brilliant side of yours.
Okay, before that, let me tell you how I became a physicist or engineer or computer scientist. I wanted to be a writer. And I remember, writing. I started writing very early in Hindi and English. I didn't learn English formally, but, just by soaking up books. So that's how I learned English, and I started writing almost immediately. So I told my mother and father, I said, I want to be a writer. My mother said, no way. And they knew somebody who taught at REC Srinagar. So they made him do an application for me, and then I got admitted, and they backed me off. They said, no, you cannot support yourself as a writer. So you have to be practical minded. You've got to be an engineer, and then you do a PhD or do this and that. But I started writing poetry very early on. I've published many books of poetry, in Hindi as well. And my very first book was published by P. Lal, Writers Workshop. He did 2 of my books. Then the great Hindi scholar, G.C. Pandey, he published my through or through his contacts in Allahabad. He had my first Hindi book published, which was called Ek Ek Tal Ek Darpan, which was a
Ekdal.
play on words. Tal can also means rhythm. It can also means a pond. So the rhythm itself is a darpan or a mirror to the rhythms of our mind, and the mirror of the pond's surface is also like the mirror that the inner saras, Saraswati, from the
So,
inner pond of our awareness. So I've written many books of poetry, and I've come back to it from time to time. And just 2 weeks ago, there was a weekend that I was free. I was not working on e-dimensionality that particular weekend. So I told my wife, I'm going to write a new book of poems, which I did that particular weekend. It's called Light of the Path of Light and Shadow. And it's right now on academia.edu. Anybody can download it. It's for
yeah,
free.
yeah.
Path of Light and Shadow. And the very first poem in that, let me go to read. Um, yeah, and it's called,
Please.
the very first poem is called To Live One Must Die Every Day. Now, this is a phrase which has
Oh,
been used by many poets, including in Hindi film songs. But I took that line and I made a poem, and here it is. To
wonderful.
live, one must die every day and not even make a sound or sigh.
Oh,
Read the notes, run the errands, answer email, and keep up with stories of the day. Walk with a smile and easy stride. Make small talk, and before lights fade, say goodbye. And when you find a quiet corner and no one's watching, let the tears flow and
oh.
softly cry.
That's the catharsis part is at the end. My goodness, you went through and through, and finally the self is evolved. The self is explained out there.
Right.
Wow.
I mean, we put up this brave face and we could be dying from inside, right? But we got to live. And it's
So
through that
wonderful.
suffering that knowledge comes, right? Without suffering, without pain, no light can come. Without heat, without Rudra,
Without
without Aghora, right? Or Ghora.
Agora,
Yeah.
Agora.
Nothing can come. So pain is the way, or suffering, or tapas, as the rishis told us. You have to do tapas. You have to do tapasya. And
Live with
it's
it.
only
Yeah.
through that heat that light emerges.
That's why what my master Parsasati Rajgopal Acharya used to say: live with the pain, live with the pain. So wonderful, sir. We are ending on this beautiful poem. We will end this wonderful conversation. We want to go on, but I know that we'll be inviting you again, and from your busy schedule. And I wish that we have another great session with you. It was your magnanimity and your love for this native channel that you visited, and whole experience was really amazing. It was so profound. We have gone through the realms of many layers of that Indic scientific civilization, and also your own work and life. It was a very candid and lucid, conversation by a personality who is an Indologist, who is such a tall personality, one of the most brilliant brains of the contemporary times. Thank you very much, sir. You came, you had a courtesy, and you volunteered to come. It's really your greatness.
Thank
And
you. Thank you, Jugalji. Wonderful. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. This is what we need. We need more of these conversations so that all of this can be brought to everybody's home. We are all one
we're
family,
all
one
one.
large family.
And before we go, there is a slightly on sad note. I want to, conclude, because we need to give a tribute to him. Also, you can give the tribute. I'll also about the Dr. Kundan Lal Chaudhary. He was one of the famous neurologists, an icon of our community, who served the community in post-migration days, and he was also a poet, a literature, a social activist, a wonderful human being, and a very strong, stout personality, whom anybody couldn't go. He was a great son of the soil. That's my tribute to him, and let's pray for his journey of his soul to eternity under the great composure of the great masters.
Yes, I was very saddened. I got to hear about it only this morning. Very saddened to hear of Dr. Kundan Lal Chaudhary's passing. A wonderful man, leader, literary person. Condolences to his family, his friends, and to the entire Kashmiri community.
Indeed, I was planning show conversation with him because I'm picking up the people in 80s and all that, but it didn't happen. Somewhere down in the line, he was ailing and something had happened in between. Anyway, peace to his soul, composure and direction to his soul. Thank you very much, Professor Padamshri, Professor Subhash Kak ji. You came to this conversation. This will remain historically live onto our archives, and it's a very valuable and a very, very cherished moment and that to have you on our conversation. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Thank you,
Pleasure.
Namaskar.
Our pleasure. So that was Padamshri Professor Subhash Kak, the tallest Indologist, the rare genius, the historian, the physicist, the theoretical physicist, the computer engineer, the person who's working on the artificial intelligence, and the person who has done a revolutionary personality, who's done a revolutionary, revealed the revolutionary wealth and treasures of our ancient Vedic science. It was a delight and enchanting session with him. We are enriched by his experiences. I think you all must be happy and for this great insightful session with such a great personality who is a native brother of ours. Thank you very much. That was all for today. But before going, I want to announce next Sunday's our guest is Harish Bahari Saab. Harish Bahari will be talking about his times, and he's one of the legendary cricketer of Kashmir, and he belonged to Punjabi Khatri family. He'll be talking about his times and life, and also about the role of Punjabi and Khatri families in building of Kashmir in some 2 or 3 centuries, since 2 or 3 in the modern Kashmir. So thank you very much. It was great pleasure to be with all of you, and I wish you all the best. That's all. Thanks a lot.